Good morning, everyone. Happy Labor Day weekend. I'm here on our beautiful front porch of our historic convent on Ocean Avenue. And I'm not sure about you, but these last few days of summer prompt me to think about the big questions of life. And just the other day, I had a few moments to read a reflection by Archbishop Fulton Sheen. Many of you may know of him. And Sheen writes that we live in a world, we're immersed in a world that manifests the divine humor. Okay, what does he mean by this? What does Fulton Sheen mean? I think what Fulton Sheen is trying to say is that if humor is our ability to see through something or perhaps beyond what's literally present in front of us, the opposite would be an overly serious person, what he would call a materialist-minded person who only sees what's truly present physically before him. So, for instance, take a comedian. We go to see a comedian and we listen to his jokes, and if we take him literally, that is, at the surface level, well, he or she probably won't be funny or will probably be offended at some of his jokes. But when we have the eyes or the ears to listen to the humor of his jokes or to see beyond what he's literally saying, well, then something's funny because it doesn't conform to a certain standard of what he's trying to say. We don't take him too seriously. I think what Fulton Sheen is trying to say is many times we take ourselves too seriously. And when we do that, we miss the great drama, the great extraordinary nature of our lives that we're surrounded by. And so the divine humor, we're able to see that which is through and beyond what's literally present. So what does he mean by the fact that the world manifests God's humor? Well, take a mountain, for instance. The literally minded person only sees a mountain. But for the one with the eyes of faith, the one who can see, is really in tune with reality in front of him, the mountain's just not a mountain, but it manifests the great power of God. The ocean's not just a body of water, but it manifests the majesty of God, the unfathomable mystery of God. We see once again that in losing God, we lose man. That when we have what many would call a secular or materialist vision of the world, we lower our sights. It flattens out reality. Life becomes kind of dull and boring. That the mountain's just a mountain. The sea is just the sea. We lose sort of this excitement that we're surrounded by. There's a line I'm thinking here from, I think it's Belloc or G.K. Chesterton. He writes, "The one who has the faith has the fun." Then when we have the eyes of faith, we see that we're immersed in an extraordinary world. Okay. Now, I think there are two obstacles that we experience on a daily basis as human beings, as men and women, that prevent us from recognizing this divine humor that we're surrounded by. The first would be our materialist friend. Let's take his criticism. He would say, okay, Louis, all well and good, but this premise that the world manifests a divine humor rests upon the reality that there's a creator or creation. I'm presupposing, he would say, my friend here who's questioning this argument, the existence of God, that the world is created. And I respond, you're right. That's a good question. But the beautiful thing about our Catholic faith, which reveals to us this great truth of creation, the beautiful thing of our faith is that it's addressed to our human reason. It's addressed to our daily experience. So if something doesn't correspond or jive, so to speak, with our reason or with our daily experience, then this criticism would be valid, that if God doesn't exist, then this material world is all there is, that this creation somehow is sparked by some chaotic, interaction of elements, for instance. But I would respond by saying, we know from our daily experience that there's something that points beyond the here and now, beyond the purely material world of our human condition. Take, for instance, music, which we hear the beautiful church bells now in the background, something that points beyond the material realm, but something we know is quite true. Take, for instance, laughter, friendship. Foremost, above all, take love, charity, something that we can't place under a microscope or compute into a scientific method. There's something immaterial of our human condition that points beyond the here and now. I also think this idea of the divine humor points to a great reality of our lives, that our lives themselves reflect this humor. And I think this could also be a response to our materialist friend who only sees what's literally in front of us, our friend who's a little overly serious about life. That if we take a step back during these days of summer and look at our lives, we'd recognize that we don't need to exist. Our lives are unnecessary. What do I mean by that? I mean that there's nothing owed to us as men and women for us to exist, that someone didn't, for instance, strong-arm God, so to speak, to create us. There's no justice or business transaction, so to speak, that propelled or prompted our existence. You can also argue, well, how can something arise from nothing? That the order around us. There's not chaos, but we see order, we see beauty. Joy is more mysterious than sorrow. We see all of this. It points to an intelligence, right? A source to the order and the cosmos in which we're immersed in. That our lives, if they're not necessary, it reveals the best thing about us. That we live in what Joseph Pieper would call, we live in a world of superabundance, a world of sheer gift. And that's exciting. It's a nice thought to think about it. We can breathe easy a bit. We don't have to take ourselves too seriously. That we live in a world that's not made of strict justice, but is built on love and of gift. And we're called to mirror that humor, that love in our own lives. Chesterton once said that the only thing that Christ hid from us when he came to earth, when he took on human flesh, was his mirth, or another way of putting it, his humor or his joy. That's really something nice to think about, that Christ hid his joy from us, or his laughter. What does he mean by that? I think this points to the second obstacle that we experience, which prevents us from recognizing, seeing, or accepting the divine humor. It's this temptation that we all share, that we all experience, that prevents us from saying yes to creation. That there's something in us that refuses to open our hearts to the extraordinary nature of reality. Maybe it's because we've been let down in our lives before. Maybe it's because we never really received a true gift from someone. There was always sort of strings attached, so to speak. Maybe it's because when we look around us, when we read the newspapers, when we turn on the television, we see a world filled with evil and sin that's caused from the free choice of our human beings that are around us. How can we live in a world of joy, of peace, of extraordinariness when we see nothing around us but sorrow and pain and heartache? I'd even point out to my materialist friend, by the way, that even sorrow or mourning points to something immaterial about us, that when a loved one dies, we have this great mystery of the human condition, that one's presence is felt most intensely in their absence. So even in our sorrow, it's manifested this immaterial nature of our human condition. There's something in us. We don't have hearts large enough to accept this great gift. That's the temptation for men and women today. Again, I think it could be from our daily experience. It could be from some hurt we have in our lives. But the great challenge for us these days of Labor Day, these last days of summer, my prayer for all of us this weekend, is that we have hearts large enough to accept this gift, the givenness of our lives, that we fine-tune our vision so we see the extraordinary reality, the superabundant nature of our lives in which we're immersed. That's my prayer for all of us this weekend. That's the great adventure of our faith, that we have the eyes to see the fun, the laughter, the joy around us. And we know that the best thing about our lives are things that don't need to exist, but they do. Fancy philosophical phrase, things that exist for their own sake, for the sake of no other end or purpose, but just because they're good in themselves, like our lives, a sheer gift. That's my prayer for all of you this weekend. I wish you a very happy Labor Day, and we'll see you next week.